Welcome to Sober Dad Crew, the podcast where we talk about all things sobriety, recovery, parenting, music, tattoos, work, and more. For more information, please visit soberdadcrew.com. Just a heads up for this episode, it contains frank discussions of childhood sexual abuse. All right, my guest this episode is Greg Benoit. He's a dad, librarian, drummer, fellow upstate New Yorker, real upstate New York, not that Hudson Valley, fake upstate New York that you hear people talk about. And he's also the host of the Common Threads podcast. Greg, welcome to Sober Dad Crew.
Hey, thank you for having me on. And you did all your homework about all the different titles and experiences that I've had. So kudos to you. And also, I love the dig at people who misapply upstate New York to refer to like Poughkeepsie or, one of those cities. I've often thought of upstate New York as the phrase is like a pejorative term from people from New York City for anything other than Manhattan or the Bronx or something like that. So I like that too.
Yeah. Up here in the post-industrial actual, upstate New York. And I used to do tourism marketing for a while, and you'd go down to New York and I'm like, no, not that upstate, like not 30 minutes north of the city, but actually like Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Ithaca, actually like that part of the world. So yeah, I get to dig in now and then.
Yeah, and you're based in close to Ithaca, or that's your closest big, for lack of better term, city?
Yeah, so I work in Ithaca, but I live in Aurora, home of the now defunct Wells College, and the Inns at Aurora.
Okay, I know right where that is. That's where the Mackenzie Childs is from there too.
Yeah, and that most of Ithaca is like funded by the woman who invented the American Girl doll. So she was a Wells alum and a huge investor in the Inns at Aurora. So yeah, now we have an empty college campus that people are trying to figure out what to do with, which is sort of interesting.
Yeah, a friend of mine got married there, so I'm familiar with the town. And my mom collects like tons of Mackenzie Child stuff, so that's how I know that connection too. So
yeah, people do love the Mackenzie Child. It is not my thing, but I like a lot of shit that people don't like either.
No, I guess I can relate to that. But when my mom got into Mackenzie Child, I was like, this person's rich, and I could have made this. Like, I could have just put a checkerboard pattern on everything and called it a day, and then charged like $70 for a dog food bowl or something.
Sometimes I feel like your kid could have made it with some of that checkerboard pattern.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's jump into
enough ragging on stuff that like middle.
Yeah. Let's get to the good stuff. How many kids do you have?
So I have two kids. One is 8, and the other is 5. And they're Freddie and Elvie. His name's Calvin. We call him Elvie for short. And then, what's notable about my family is like everyone in the household has like some level of neurodivergence. Both of my kids have ADHD, and then my oldest has autism. And so I wind up speaking about that quite a bit. I've done a couple different hardcore punk related podcasts, but similar to yours, I find that, the music is kind of what sustains me through the challenges of life. And so I wind up talking about just parenting in general, parenting when you yourself have a mental illness, and then parenting for kids who are neurodivergent, or in the case of my oldest, who has autism.
There is that parenting through your own like mental health, or, the theme of this, substance abuse and recovery. And it's a challenge. I have 4 kids that, the younger 2, technically my stepkids, but I view them just as my kids. They're 9, 13, almost 18, and almost 22. So I have this range of ages, and it's pretty interesting sort of to go back again. I was sort of almost done with the active thing, and then I met my wife, and you know we fell in love, and then I fell in love with these two kids, and so it's interesting to have that perspective. And I don't think there's ever any, no kid is without different challenges, right? Like, be it neurodivergent or other mental health things or academic or what it is. So it's, you don't know what you're going to get when you go into it.
Yeah, it's like buying a house, kind of like it looks fine from the curb. When you see your friends having kids, you think I can do that too. And then when you get into a house of your own, you realize there's like foundation problems and you don't know how to use basic power tools. So that's kind of been my experience too. But I think for me, the hallmark of having kids, what's really been the most salient experience is it forced me to address a lot of the mental health issues that I had kind of wallpapered over or had, bandaged up in a way that let me get through my day and have a productive work life. As somebody who, was single and then married. But once kids enter in the picture and you're dealing with sleep deprivation and you're just consistently have to put someone else's needs ahead of your own, it starts water starts leaking through the cracks in the dam. And it really forced me to address some of those things that I don't know that I ever would have addressed if I hadn't had kids. Certainly not at that particular point in time in my life.
Yeah, that rings so true to me. I mean, when the oldest was born, and I mean, that is when I think I always had this sort of, what do they call it, dysthymia, that low level kind of depression.
Mm-hmm.
But boy, that lack of sleep and just, changes in the relationship with your spouse and just worry. I mean, I just remember being like, oh my God, like who said that I should have this little tiny human being? And I'd always wanted to be a dad, like I always had. But then you're like, it's hard. I mean, it's incredible and beautiful and all that, but it's also just, it can be hard.
Yeah, I had like some more uncertainty, about whether, I wanted to have kids than I think a lot of people who jump into it wind up doing it. And maybe on some level, everyone's unsure. But just, in basic terms, I kind of look at the world as I've experienced it and think like, well, this place isn't good enough to receive anybody's children. But I also had, some serious and very significant childhood trauma that my parents were completely oblivious to. So I know like firsthand that simply because you have a couple of parents who love you and, provide you with all of your, essential needs and then some, doesn't mean that, you're going to have a good time or that you're going to be able to get where you need to go in life. That there can be things that are invisible to even them. So when I got into having kids, when my oldest was born, I kind of faked it, I think, for probably about 6 to 8 months. But then I just completely collapsed, mental health wise. And that's when addiction started for me. I didn't really have any, a full on addiction, prior to, my son being born. So I've often felt, pretty depressed or humiliated by that, that like this time that at least in our culture is built up as this joyous, beautiful time, was like the thing that finally broke me. But I'm glad that it forced me to start addressing, things that I had left unaddressed for so long.
Yeah. Can you dig into that, a little more, and, sort of what was your substance of choice? And then, what did you do towards the end of recovery? Did you do a program or therapy
Yeah.
or a smorgasbord?
Yeah. So, I guess, I'll tell it chronologically just because, that makes the most sense. But, between the ages of 4 and 8, I was regularly sexually abused by a family member, not, my parents, not my grandparents. And that went on pretty much every weekend, for 4 years. And it was at times very violent. It would happen to me in my sleep. I'd be at these like sleepovers, and I would just wake up to physical pain and sexual abuse. And that's very important information later on. The relationship with sleep. So that went on, and it was terrifying and traumatizing. But I think the most damaging aspect of the whole thing was the psychological manipulation that went into getting me to keep the secret. Also because it was a family member and it was taking place at family events, holidays, birthdays. It kind of seeped into a lot of different memories and areas of my life that probably would have been left, preserved if it had just been like some bully in the neighborhood or something who had done that. So that went on for 4 years. I thought about it every day since then. It caused me to feel, basically unsafe in all of my relationships, especially my most important relationships. But, there's always this underlying fear in relationships. Am I safe? Is this person going to abuse their position in my life? Are they going to abuse if they have authority over me, like in the workplace or when you're younger in the family dynamic? And I had this really unhealthy level of self-awareness at a young age that just totally disrupted my childhood. It also made me very aware of, kind of these unseen things like group dynamics and family dynamics. And I realized at way too young an age that like people can use these things that don't exist in physical reality, to their advantage in ways that are damaging to others. And so I've always been very skeptical of like authority figures, religious institutions, any group, even my chosen communities that I'm a part of, any group where there's powerful group dynamics at play, are something that I, on some level I'd like to avoid. But if you do that, you have a life that's devoid of any connection to community. So that's kind of the Cliff's Notes version of my childhood. That happened. It wasn't until I was in like 5th grade or middle school and I started encountering, things on TV or on the radio or in magazines, about like sexual abuse and childhood trauma. And that was when I started to build an awareness of just how damaging this thing that happened to me was. I, detested it and, loathed these sleepovers where this would happen. But I didn't really know that this was something that was going to cause psychological damage to me because I was like 4 years old. So once I got into middle school, I started to get really angry about it. I had always known I was different. I was always afraid people could tell that had happened to me. As I got older, I was afraid that it caused, serious psychological damage, which it did. But I also was afraid because, the manipulation was so intense. And I was like so afraid for my life. There were plenty of times where I did not, like physically resist. And what does that mean for me and my will to survive and my view of myself and my self-worth? So I kind of had that going on underneath me. And I speak a little bit about this in the first 3 episodes of Common Thread podcast with my co-host Rory. Rory is someone who I've known basically since I was a teenager, since I got involved in skateboarding and hardcore and punk. And he's been in a number of really successful bands. Soul Control is probably the biggest one. They were on Bridge 9 Records, but he's been in a very popular Rochester band called Standfast from the late 90s. And he's in some bands that are currently performing: Achilles, Hard to Know, and Coming Down. In fact, Coming Down just had a record release show on Friday, and you might want to check that out if you like kind of the post-hardcore sound. But Rory wrote a song about his experience overcoming childhood abuse, sexual abuse, that was deeply meaningful for me. It was one of the first times that somebody I actually knew in real life was speaking about having this experience that I had seen people on TV and on talk shows and call-in shows on the radio talk about. But this was like a real person that I knew, and, that and I had known on like a personal level. So if you're interested in more of that background, you can definitely check out those episodes of Common Thread. I won't try to repeat too much of the stuff, that I said in that episode.
Yeah, and I'll link out to that for folks because that's how I found you, and it's a cool podcast, so it's definitely worth people checking out.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. So, middle school, high school, I get into hardcore and punk. It's a natural outlet for this anger that I have in me, rage that had built up, from having to endure this. I never got into drugs or alcohol at a young age, and I was very proud of that. I was straight edge from the time I was like 14 until my mid 30s. And hardcore was kind of my outlet for that anger. It was kind of the sense of community that really the only community that I've known. I've never been very active in like church or like civic groups other than just going to work and then a family, of course. So hardcore and punk have been a very important support for me throughout my entire life because of this childhood trauma. It's where I met my wife. It's where I've met most of my friends. And frankly, built a lot of the skills up, networking with people, planning, group events, collaborating and compromising with people. I take all these skills into my professional job as a library director. And it sounds silly because like people will go to like the Toastmasters to learn how to public speak. And, people will take like classes at a community college to learn, some of these skills, but I kind of picked them up along the way, just by like introducing myself at shows and putting myself out there in the hardcore punk scene. But, anger has been a problem for me the way that like drugs were a problem for me. And that's caused me to like burn down a lot of my relationships, especially when I was younger. So I specifically have PTSD. And I would have all these really unhelpful, unnecessary fight or flight responses throughout, the day. And most of the time I had pretty high level of self-awareness related to that. So I could tamp it down, at least when I was like out in public, but I'd like come apart at home. But I would, eventually I'd get to a point where I couldn't manage it anymore. And I'd wind up burning down relationships that probably didn't need to really be walked away from, or having conflicts with people that didn't deserve to have a conflict, between them and I. In fact, Rory, my co-host, and I've known him for so long, and he's played such an important role in my life. But there was like a period where we had a falling out in a way that, when I was younger, if I had the skills that I have now and the self-awareness that I have now, I probably could have navigated that in a way that didn't, result in so many hurt feelings and missed opportunities, for friendship. So, I did a pretty good job keeping myself bandaged together throughout my teens, 20s, and 30s. But then once I became a library director, it's a pivotal point in my life. It's a leadership role. I started to have a lot of anxiety, and a lot of nightmares. And the anxiety would be around like having to assert boundaries with people who don't respect boundaries, having to stand up to authority figures, having to stand up to bullies, having to do some of the things that anyone in any leadership role knows that they have to do, whether it's in a workplace or in your own family. And so that would just cause me so much stress. And I eventually wound up going on a couple of anti-anxiety medications in my early 30s. Typical stuff like SSRIs, but I was also prescribed benzodiazepines. And that was like, that solved so many problems for me. I used them more or less responsibly for like 5 years until my kids came along. But I mentioned the sleep issues. This abuse would begin in my sleep, and so I've often had a very hard time falling asleep and staying asleep. There at various points in time in my life, I have had some level of comfort kind of alluding to my childhood. And so there was a point in time where I couldn't say like I had this traumatic thing happen to me and I have PTSD. The best I could do was just say I have insomnia. I like can't fall asleep and I wake up really easily. And when I do wake up, I just can't fall asleep. And then the morning comes and the birds are chirping and it's the worst sound in the world. And then, as I built kind of my comfort level with myself and got into therapy and recovery, I could speak a little bit more openly like I am able to now. But I basically went to my doctor and was like, hey, I'm having all this anxiety. I have this stressful job. I can't sleep. I have all this insomnia. I didn't, speak to the childhood trauma or the sexual abuse because I wasn't able to. Like the only person I told in my life prior to my whole life falling apart was my wife. And I had like one conversation with her when I was like 22 about it. And I didn't really get into any details because I was like so afraid people would judge me. Why didn't you stand up for yourself? I've had a lot of guilt around it. I wish I had spoken up when I was younger because I could have gotten the help, but I could have also potentially prevented other people from being harmed by my abuser, which is something I still, struggle with. So once I was prescribed benzodiazepines, it solved all my problems related to sleep. So many stories start out like this, where you have this issue and then, some chemical comes into your life, legal or otherwise, and it fixes the problems, at least temporarily. I understand now that they don't treat treat PTSD with benzodiazepines for probably the exact reason that, I had, or the exact problem I had. And so once my kid was born, I started having, the most intense nightmares I've ever had in my life about, the rapes. In my dreams, they are as real as the moment they were happening to me. And so whereas I would take maybe a couple pills throughout the week, at nighttime, I was taking them every night. And then, as it goes, that wasn't enough. So, well, now I'll take 2 one night, and then tomorrow night I'll just white knuckle it or take some Benadryl, and that'll bridge the gap. And then the following night I'll take 2 more. And eventually you just keep doing that math where you're like taking a month's worth in a week. It got to the point where, I was like ordering gray market analogs off the internet where they basically change one molecule. So it's not technically illegal or can't be said that it's, the controlled substance, but it still has that same effect on your body. And that was like the worst of it, because then once I got into that, I didn't have to kind of measure myself out like I did when I was, getting them from the pharmacy. And that was like the scariest period of time in my life. I knew I couldn't continue it forever, but I didn't really know how to stop. And eventually it all came apart. And I told my wife and my mom what was going on. And I got into like an outpatient program that I did. And that was helpful, but, I still talked about the addiction as being a product of like work stress. And I was like afraid to just like be like, oh, hey, I was like sexually abused as a 4-year-old because I thought people would judge me. And maybe some people do. I know there's like a lot of stuff out in pop psychology that like, if your stepdad beats you, you're going to grow up to beat kids too. And if, you were abused as a kid, you might be an abuser yourself, and I gather that there's some truth to that, but it's not a universal law. So I didn't really speak to the trauma of that experience in these group sessions in outpatient, which probably would have made it a much more impactful and worthwhile endeavor. But I just didn't feel comfortable, and I try to have compassion for who I was then. I should also say too, like this was a program where like people were like court ordered to be there. I was pretty sure there were some of the guys in the group, they didn't want to be there. They seemed like the type of person that might be physically abusive to people in their life, if not, financially abusive or sexually abusive too. And I just didn't feel right about opening up in a room where, there were some folks like that in the mix. So I did that program for a year and it helped, but I never addressed the underlying issue. I had started therapy too a little bit before I actually, this whole had blossomed into an addiction, but I never spoke about the childhood trauma with the therapist I was seeing back then because I just wasn't in that place where I could. And it's a big regret of mine. But I wasn't there yet, and I have to try to be patient with myself now after the fact. So I'd been clean from benzodiazepines for a while. And it was, I was basically still kind of white knuckling it. I didn't find until I started talking about the childhood trauma that recovery became easier and started to click. I relapsed on some just cannabis gummies when the pandemic had started. That was like a really challenging time too because of the pandemic. We were getting my son diagnosed with his special needs, which was a difficult situation in its own right, not related to my childhood trauma. And then, at that point in time was when he turned 4. And that was like a really weird milestone that affected me in ways I didn't think it would. But seeing him as a 4-year-old and knowing that's how old I was when the abuse began, really, really was hard. I used to beat myself up so much at every age, as a teenager, as a young adult in my 20s and 30s. Why didn't I say something? Why didn't I do something? And when I, saw my own kid as a 4-year-old, I was like, well, I didn't say anything or do anything because I was 4 and I didn't have the vocabulary words to even describe what was happening to me. And I had to really fully sit with how powerless I was. So that was a tough time, but nowhere near as hard as benzodiazepines for me. I eventually got into a recovery program called Recovery Dharma. It's like a Buddhism-based recovery program. Yeah, so I facilitate a weekly meeting with that, and I participate in other meetings that they have throughout the week just as a participant. And I like that a lot. I've often had a lot of interest in Eastern religions and Eastern philosophy, particularly like in Buddhism, the concept of anatta, which I think is the Sanskrit term, which is non-self. There's this concept of equanimity, which is roughly analogous to like grace in the Catholic tradition. And it's resonated with me in a way that like Christianity never has, in part because Christianity was kind of used to manipulate me as a child, to keep the secret of the abuse. And so I just never connected with it. I've always been very skeptical of it. But Buddhism was, kind of untarnished by that abuse. So it was an avenue for self-improvement and self-discovery in a way that no other religion has been. I'm also an atheist, and I'm not going to change my fundamental view of reality to try to, fit in with a religious program that just isn't a good fit. So I participate in that. And I've been going to those, I think, since 2020. And then I go to therapy too. I do EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, which is a kind of therapy specifically for PTSD. I've also done cognitive behavioral therapy, which I kind of is probably mostly what I do when I'm in therapy in a one-on-one session with my current therapist, and then we occasionally will do stints of EMDR therapy. But I found EMDR therapy to be probably the single best thing I've done for helping with the traumatic memories. And it's I'm not cured. I have nightmares all the time. Probably 3 nights a week I have a nightmare about being forcibly raped or some other horrific memory from my past. But I'm not screaming in my sleep and trying to fight off an attacker in my sleep, which would happen probably 2 to 5 nights a week, during some of the worst parts of my, my life. So to answer your question, I know I've been talking for a while. Benzodiazepines are definitely the drug of choice because they make sleep so much easier. A second issue that kind of popped up, but was more easily addressed, was the cannabis gummies. And then the thing that's helped, therapy, recovery, dharma, and then going to therapy with my wife too. We do couples therapy, And that is partially related to kind of rebuilding trust and creating a healthy, open dialogue between the two of us. But it's also, we have a kid with special needs, and the divorce statistics for parents of kids with special needs are like astronomical. It's like 85 to 95% wind up getting a divorce. And I like knew that going in. So I'm like, okay, well, we got to get into couples counseling so we can have, an open dialogue.
I mean, that's so smart. I mean, I remember thinking, and I said this to, it was actually a friend of mine, and he was like, younger than me, and just having these sort of inklings of issues of the marriage. I was like, do it now, man. Like most people, it's too late. By the time you're in it, it's just, there's too much damage has been done. So like, I commend like being on the front end of that,
if I'm being
so
honest,
smart.
I mean, it's saved us probably both a lot of grief, but I wish I'd done it before I started taking drugs. And, I could have saved a lot more trouble, but I was just, and it's one of the hardest things. It's like, I just couldn't talk about this with anyone, not even, especially not the people closest to me. So, and I should mention too, like my wife, her seeing me addicted, especially to benzodiazepines, but just in general, has been very traumatizing for her. And, I'm grateful that we're still together, that we have a good relationship, that we enjoy each other's company, and that we can do things as a family, and kind of provide those kind of foundational memories for our sons. But I'm so grateful that she stuck with me and has been with me, even though there's, it's not just been a straight shot to a perfect life. Once you start therapy or get into recovery, because she's my best friend. I've been with her since I was 19. And I, probably will never be as close to another person, in my life, depending on how long I live. I don't think, even if I live to be 100, I'll get to know someone as well as I've gotten to know her. So I'm so grateful that I still have that, relationship, and that where we've grown together stronger from it, and where we need to still work on it, and where I need to still, improve, I'm able to do that.
Yeah. I mean, thank you so much for sort of sharing that story. It's intense, and, I'm sorry that happened. And I hope maybe we live in a world a little bit where, it's years past that, where there's more openness and dialogue and understanding by kids. I don't know. It probably really depends a little bit on the family that you were raised in, and the circumstances. But I also was thinking, it's so much as progress, not perfection, right? Like I battled this notion of like being the perfect dad, being the perfect, part, all these things. And it was like, man, like perfectionism was like so the enemy for me. Like I had to really learn, and like Brene Brown's audiobook, The Gift of Imperfect Parenting, was super important for me, because I was like, oh, I'm like better at this when I'm trying not to be like perfect, actually, and like cut myself a little slack, or like understand, like, man, my older two, they didn't want to be kids of divorce, right? Like that blows, I didn't go into that marriage wanting divorce, right? That's not why you go into it. But I had to like forgive myself a lot of that stuff. I mean, I was the other, like the Flaming Lip song, Waiting for Superman, was like super meaningful for me. I don't know if you know that song, but like,
yeah, I do.
That was such a meaningful tune for me at that period of time. Because I was like, all right, I'm trying to be this like superhero, like, it's just not possible.
Well, and you mentioning Brene Brown, that's someone that people have recommended to me, and I've listened to her on some podcasts. And there's like a Buddhist writer, Tara Brach, who has a book called Radical Acceptance, which I think gets to some of the same things that Brene Brown is really known for, but like resonated with me in a little bit better way. So her book, Radical Acceptance, is something that folks who struggle with perfectionism should check out. And I've heard it said so many times before that like perfectionism is a trauma response. And I think that's true because I developed my fixation on perfectionism through this unhealthy self-awareness at such a young age that people are, looking into my life and judging me and potentially manipulating me in ways that I don't consent to, but can't really put my finger on. I also, so much of my life was spent, trying to be perfect for like my parents or other members of my family because there was like this weird belief that I had even into my 20s where like if I could just make my parents proud enough that somehow that would absolve me from the shame and the guilt, from not speaking up or from just having to have endured that. And so now that I'm parenting my kids, I like know this intellectually, but I still struggle to live it on a day-to-day basis. Some days, like I have this belief in the back of my mind, like, oh, I could be missing something. There's like additional information that I might need about what's going on in their life that they don't know to tell me or they don't feel comfortable telling me. That's kind of where I'm at presently and where one of my big struggles is. Like I already have this problem of hypervigilance, and the solution to the problem of hypervigilance isn't to just like build a personality and an identity and a life around that. It's to set it down and know that like you're going to make mistakes as a parent, but they're probably not going to turn out as bad as things did for me when I was a kid. Because that is the exception and not the norm. But when you only have one lived experience, you don't, that's not good enough. Like 100% of the lives I've lived have, endured horrific abuse. So it just must be everywhere. And that's not actually the case. One byproduct of having a kid with special needs, having two kids with ADHD, they require a lot of, my wife or I to be present like constantly. And it's exhausting at times, but the silver lining is like, I don't just send them off to like some sleepover somewhere or to some family member I kind of see, and is willing to like take them for the day because it's not possible to do that. So I have like a level of awareness of what's going on in their lives. But yeah, man, that imperfection thing, letting go of that is really, I think, one of the bigger challenges in recovery, both from addiction, but also any kind of mental illness.
Yeah, I would think that putting down the hypervigilance is also harder with kids with special needs, right? You're just like, you're always protective over your kids, but like just in my experience with some of the struggles that my kids have had, there have been moments where I'm like so on guard, and like so protective. And I guess part of it is you can't protect your kids like from everything, but to let that down a little bit, it can be super hard.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it spot on, and I have a better appreciation for like my own parents, what they were going through, raising kids, and anyone who's ever been in a situation where like that at work or something, I've relied on people before I had kids who were parents, and I'm like, oh, it's his problem. Why is he like not fully present today or something? And I get it now in a way that I didn't quite get then, or maybe I knew intellectually but couldn't fully empathize with. It's so hard not to be protective, and then when you add that extra layer of they're going to have special needs, it's a challenge, but it's also, like the work of my life. And one thing that makes it easier is, being open about it with people. I've met so many awesome people through hardcore, who are my age, or maybe a little younger, a little older. They've got, a kid with autism or Down syndrome or just severe ADHD. And building connections with folks through my community at every stage of my life has just been such a joy. Getting to know other folks like you, for instance, who have some awareness of or influence by punk and hardcore, and are now parents themselves has really been just so great. And in fact, common thread is kind of is kind of that in a nutshell. It's Rory and I. He's also got two sons. They're roughly the same age as my boys. And so we're early on in the podcast, but we're getting into that quite a bit. And so I hope it's something that people who are raising kids and come from like a nonconformist, non-traditional background would consider checking out, because definitely when you march to the beat of a different drum, you need that communal support. You need that friendship support.
Yeah. And there's something, maybe it was episode 3, which is really episode 2, because you had your first episodes are kind of these sub episodes that really set the stage. But you guys were talking about introducing your kids to the things you love.
Yeah.
And I totally like feel that, and like especially like talking about Star Trek, but also music.
Yeah.
It's so fundamental to me. And it was the other night I had this moment. So my 13-year-old plays club soccer, and so we get these drives to Syracuse. At least once a week, I take her to practice. I let her, it's her phone. She plays the music, it's sometimes it's too much for me. But she had Adele on, and she was like grooving to Adele. I'm like, I can feel it. I like Adele. Like, this is good. And the other night was like, hey, if you liked that, check out Joss Stone. I don't know if you remember.
Yeah.
Or she did that cover of Fell in Love with a Girl, White Stripes. And she's like 16 and this, British soul singer. And I just like, I texted her and I said, hey, just like this weekend, just please listen to it once. And then she had a friend over today and they were like cranking it up. And I was like, it's like what a little win. It doesn't always work. Like I don't seem to get people to sit down and watch Star Wars with me, but it's interesting. Like, you have the things you love, you want to share the things you love, but you can't like just force them on your kids because they're just who they are.
Well, and the instant you try to do that, then you like make it dad's uncool lame thing, and who wants to be into some lame stuff your dad was in, So I guess I appreciate that too, because there's all kinds of stuff my dad tried to share with me, and I'm like, I don't got time for this. It's
so loud. Why does my dad listen to loud music?
Yeah. But yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned Star Trek, because that's a big thing of mine. And I spent a while talking about that on the podcast. And my oldest, one of his special interests in like his autism is like space and physics, and kind of the physics of how like galaxies and solar systems form. And he's like found this YouTube channel, and we have like YouTube locked down pretty good, because that's another like rat's nest of terrors.
Yeah. All of that can be horrific in about 2 seconds.
Yeah, no, I mean, like now my goal in life is just like, I don't want my kids to grow up to idolize like Andrew Tate. Like if nothing else happens but they don't like him, then I guess I'm a success, at least by my standard that I'm setting for myself right here.
Yeah, I can't remember when I first said this, but I was like, I think it was before I got remarried, but I was like, I want the girls to be like, strong and have every opportunity anyone else could have. And I want like the boys to not be assholes and rapists. I mean, I think it's like I think I said it a little more eloquently than that, but I get it. Like, I want to put good human beings out in the world. Like that's my parenting goal. Like, love whatever music you want. I really don't care. I want you to be a good person. Like, that's my goal. Success as a parent is like putting a good human being out in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's like, and my parents did that for me. They came from a generation where it's like, well, you got to go to college at this time, and you got to get a job, and you got to move out by this time. And it's like, I've got a fundamentally different outlook as a dad. Like, I don't know. It's a mystery for me what my kid's going to be like when he's 18 or 20. Like, maybe he'll be working as a computer programmer, living on his own. Maybe he'll live in a group home and have a job. Maybe he'll just live with me for the rest of my life. And so, like, I don't have that same level of, like, you've got to hit these milestones at these ages the way that my parents really drilled that into me. And in some ways, that was like a form of trauma in its own, living up to their standard while also carrying the weight in secret of all this abuse. But like, all I want for my kids is really just to like treat other people the way that they state that they wish to be treated and go out of their way to find out what that is, because
Yeah.
people don't always think to tell you. And as long as I can get them to do that, I think opportunities will open up before them, because I've had so many friends, they don't have the same education I have. They don't have on paper the same skill set that I have, but they find opportunities, and the way that they found them was by being a better friend than I was able to be when I was like PTSDing and burning my life down, because I thought that was the only way I could stay safe. So I want them to be that kind of person, and I mostly got there, but not without a few detours. Oh, and the Star Trek thing, because I didn't tie that back up. But so my son, he's got autism. He's like super interested in space, and he's found these like videos that they're like beyond me. Like they're like basically college level, and he's 8, but he's like, he gets them, and he can like paraphrase the information to them in a way where I understand that he knows what's going on in them. And it's like, these are concepts that are like 3 steps removed from like the most hardcore science episode of like Star Trek. So I'm like, okay, we got to bring it down. We got to bring it down back down to Dad's level, and put this back in terms that would fit on like a primetime TV show in 1992.
Right, with a transporter. So do you have a favorite Star Trek series?
Oh, it's definitely Next Generation. And I like get into this in the podcast too, but like I would distract myself from like all these intrusive thoughts as a kid by watching Star Trek, because it was like heady enough and required enough of my brain power that I couldn't like run in the background all of this catastrophizing that I was doing, and all of this hypervigilance. So I could like shut that down to free up the RAM, on the computer, when I watched Star Trek as a kid. But definitely Next Generation. In my role as a library director, I fail every time at this, but I try my best to emulate, Captain Picard's leadership style. He's, like one of the greatest fictitious leaders of all time, as far as I'm concerned. And yeah, I watch that still like almost every night. I watch reruns of one of the, Next Generation, Voyager, or Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, there's, especially Next Generation, there is a real hopeful presentation of the future, which I like, especially now. I mean, I also loved Deep Space Nine because there's a real long form story there, and a really political tone to it that I thought was pretty great, and kind of got into some murky ethical areas. So I still watch those. I mean, I was in college when Next Generation was rolling out, and we had to reserve the lounge with the TV to watch it, but it's just so good. And I love Star Wars, but I kind of like Star Wars better without Jedis, I've discovered.
Oh yeah. Yeah, Rogue One was like my favorite Star Wars movie, because it was like pretty grim, and it was, I mean, I guess you have that kind of like proto Jedi in there, but it was just like a really good war movie.
Yeah, and the Empire was like bad, like actually bad. Yeah, I just started Andor season 2 this weekend because I like, brilliant, and also so timely right now, given what's going on in our country, in the world, but especially our country, and this hyper authoritarianism that seems to be rearing its head right now.
Yeah. To bring it back to Star Trek, like Next Generation, that's the version of the future I want to live in, but I feel like Deep Space Nine is a more accurate kind of reflection of what our current state of affairs is. And they never would have gotten into all the like politics on Next Generation, because they wanted to portray like the Federation and humanity as like having evolved and solved all these fundamental problems, whereas like Deep Space Nine kind of acknowledges that like, no, there's still untrustworthy people running around on Earth.
Yeah, 100%.
There's still political intrigue. So I haven't checked out Andor yet. I got to check that one out. But I did like
it's very
the
Mandalorian
excellent too. Yeah.
Not ones you can really show your younger kids though.
Yeah,
it's like the reality violence level amped up a little bit with those.
Well, and it's in some ways, I know this is not like a nerd podcast, but in some ways, like Star Wars acknowledging that they have a huge fan base that aren't kids has been like really liberating, because I don't think they ever would have attempted to make, and you know, it was always a little dark and gritty, but I don't think they would have ever attempted to make shows like The Mandalorian, you know, in 1995 or whenever they were making the remastered versions of the original trilogy, because they're just so inaccessible and inappropriate for kids.
Yeah, and I'm old enough because I'm 54 that I saw the original Star Wars in the theater. I was what, 7. And that is a foundational memory for me, and being scared when Darth Vader like comes through the door on the ship, because it was so crowded we weren't sitting together, which seems insane to me now.
Yeah.
To not sit with my 7-year-old in a dark crowded movie theater seems totally insane. But that was also the time when you're like, get on your bike and ride away and like come back
Yeah.
later in the day. And
Well, even for me, I rode my bike to school in kindergarten, and I'm like, what the hell are they
yeah,
thinking? But it was like, I wasn't even the only one. Like, I would never let my kids ride
yeah,
their bikes
uphill
to school.
both ways.
Yeah. But yeah, I wanted to dip back into some of the recovery and mental health stuff, because I had a few other things I wanted to make sure I spoke to. And namely that being, people think that like 12 step is like kind of all there is. And I'm not putting anybody's recovery program down. But there are a lot of non-traditional programs out there that people can look into. Recovery Dharma is one that's worked really well for me, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work well for everyone else. But the thing that really made it click for me was there's like a portion, usually about 10 to 20 minutes of each meeting, where there's a meditation. And I've even gone to like a wellness therapy place that had just meditation classes for like an hour. You do just 3 different kinds of meditations, and some would be guided, some would be silent, some would be like walking. They'd open you up to different types of people who would facilitate those types of things. So there's all kinds of different meditation apps out there, and some of them are good, but a lot of them are junk. But the thing that really made Recovery Dharma click for me in both my mental health recovery and in substance abuse recovery is meditation and mindfulness and being present in the present moment. Like, for the longest time in my life, I never really viewed the present as anything other than just like a staging ground for my anxieties and plans about the future, or my like regrets and ruminations about the past. And like now is like basically all there is. There's like the future and the past are basically exist as concepts. And there's just the eternal now. And in this moment, there's always something you can find, even if it's minuscule, that is enjoyable and wholesome. It also kind of opened me up to this idea that I needed from PTSD, which is there's a way to conduct myself in this present moment in my affairs with others that avoid conflict, not where you're conflict averse, but where you're respecting other people's boundaries, and you're also asserting your own in ways that are constructive and not destructive, which is what I'd become so accustomed to. So I wanted to just like speak a little bit to how important meditation is to me, and how helpful that's been on a number of different fronts. It's like one of my goals, again, getting back to like not just shoving your like esoteric hobby down your kid's throat. Like, getting my kids into meditation is something that I really want to do, but I gotta present it to them in just the right way, because I know it can be so helpful for people with ADHD and autism.
Yeah, I mean, I've sort of fallen off that practice, but early, and I didn't do a program. I sort of just stopped, and I did a lot of therapy and kind of went into meditation on my own, and discovered the book Dharma Punks, which was great. Unfortunately, he kind of had some Me Too stuff, which is too bad, because there's like a lot of richness to that book, and I struggle with that, as a thing.
And Recovery Dharma is an offshoot of Refuge Recovery, and I guess for the uninitiated, there's a recovery program that was created by this guy Noah Levine. He wrote this book Dharma Punks. And, it's a great program. It's a great book. All the wisdom in it is valid. But, he had like had some Me Too stuff. He had had some consensual but inappropriate relationships with female students. And like, if you're trying to start a religious movement or a self-help movement, like the number one worst thing you can do is like bring sex into it with your students. Like that's
Yeah, it's a
never,
no.
or yeah. So rightfully, a lot of people felt like betrayed and uncomfortable with it. And then from that initial recovery program is what Recovery Dharma is an offshoot of. But yeah, I would say that like that Dharma Punk's book is a great book, and the foundation that, you know, Noah Levine laid is valid in all of its wisdom. It's just, you know, in Recovery Dharma, there's like no leader, and they like state that specifically, like in this like preamble that they read before each meeting.
Yeah, which is also in its own way kind of punk rock, right? Like eschewing sort of this leader. But I did a lot of meditation, and like silent meditation, man, is hard. Like there's like, I as an adult got, diagnosed with ADHD, and like I was like, oh, that's why my brain was like so loud all the time. And like, oh, I'm not like trying to interrupt people. I'm not trying to like not listen to you. Like there's like a lightning storm going on in
Yeah.
there.
Well, and that's interesting that you mentioned that that's your experience. Because like when I first started going to therapy and reading about like PTSD and saying like, I think this is what I have, and really doing the work to help address that, it started improving these other aspects of my life in ways that I never thought possible. And I'm not, like I said before, I'm not cured. I'm not perfect. Have all kinds of bad days and stressors that I'm like not 100% sure I'm managing it the correct way. But once I like put a label on it and could like engage with coping mechanisms that were designed for that label, it improved me so much. But I've often wondered if I have some ADHD myself, or even like on the spectrum to some degree, because I just see so much of what my kids do. And I'm like, well, I did that. And they're like, well, that's an ADHD thing, or that's an autism thing. I'm like, well, I did that when I was a kid. And even like my wife, she kind of came to realize that she has ADHD because we were going through the process to get our son diagnosed. And she's like, this is me. That's how I was as a kid. This is how I still am. And so like, like one of the things I've like really learned in therapy and a little bit in recovery is like respecting boundaries, other people's boundaries. And like, there were times I'd have conflicts with people, not because I was like hypervigilant and PTSDing on them and having like an unhelpful fight response when I didn't need one. I had conflict with people because there was like a boundary that they may have been asserting with me, but I didn't even see it. And like, that's like part of ADHD and autism, is you just don't see boundaries between things. And there's a lot of advantage to that in some capacities, but in one capacity, like building healthy interpersonal relationships, it can be a challenge.
Yeah.
So I get
Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you or talk over you thing.
Right. Like I try really hard to not be like a dick, right? Like that's sort of like one of my like rules of life is like just try not to be an asshole. And also like, I mean, really what I say is every day in all the things, dad, husband, coworker, try and just be a little better incrementally
Yeah.
every day. It doesn't have to be a lot, but just every day incrementally just a little better. So at the end of the day, you can be like, all right, that was like a pretty good day. And the hard stuff comes up, and it's sort of then it tests you. How do you react when the hard thing comes up? Or my wife's a therapist, and she deals a lot with PTSD and trauma and all that. And she's like, talking about people's trauma responses. That shit is real. And that's like a trauma response is like putting 1,000 volts of electricity through somebody. And then the world's expecting them to just react like no big deal.
Yeah. Well, and it makes it easier to like explain situations in retrospect to people too, where it's like, oh, hey, this is what I was going through at that point in time in my life. Not that it's an excuse, but it puts it into its appropriate context. And that, humans do this awful thing where like we don't think somebody else's suffering is legitimate until we discover its origin. It's like not good enough that it's like, oh, you need these reasonable accommodations. We need to know why. And
Right.
I probably was that person at some point, especially in like, environments other than the workplace where you don't have those rules put on it. But now I try to be the kind of person where it's like, well, if somebody needs some kind of accommodation or they want to do something different, like just let them. Like it's their life. Just let them. They know their life better than anyone else. So, just give them the grace if you can't give them support.
Yeah, I mean, I love the notion of grace. I mean, I know it often has sort of this sort of Christian connotation to it, but to me, like the notion of like it just grace and gratitude. My grandmother always talked about being like greatly blessed, and this was, a woman who raised three girls in World War II while my grandfather was like in the Pacific in the Navy, right? And no matter how hard things got for her, she just always said, like, my life was just blessed. It was greatly blessed. I'm greatly blessed. I was like, that is such just a fundamental, like, it's like, I think it's part of my DNA, like her viewpoint of like looking at the world with gratitude.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned World War II. World War II is another area where I'm very interested in. My dad, who actually is a recovering alcoholic and has 45 years of continuous sobriety, was an American history teacher, and he just loved World War II. My grandfathers both were in World War II, and both my families, my mom's family, my dad's family, were profoundly impacted by World War II. And I often think about how the trauma of that war is probably still reverberating through my life and through the assumptions that I make about the world, in positive ways and in negative ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. My grandfather he was in Nagasaki. He was a doctor, and he
Oh,
was in
wow.
Nagasaki after the bomb was dropped. But his brother had been in Burma. So, right. So, people who don't really know, Burma was probably the most intense, like
Yeah.
close quarters, like combat of that war in the Pacific. And he only ever spoke about that to my grandfather, and now we would have like language, right? No one talked about PTSD for World War
Yeah.
One vets or the shell shock, right? That was like sort of the term, but no one talked about that or had tools for people to kind of work through that as vets. So it's yeah, it's just interesting because growing up, like, and my parents had said they wanted to get married on December 7th, which is Pearl Harbor Day. And my grandfather's like, no, you may not get married on Pearl Harbor Day. So they got married the next day. But, like so many kids now, like, don't even know. Like 9/11, like,
Yeah.
my oldest is almost 22. He was born after 9/11, right? So, like, and I was a history major, so like I'm just deeply interested in history and sort of the patterns of history, which I really look at now. Like, okay, there's an ebb and flow, and we're in something now that's probably a natural cycle of the historical pattern. It's just hard to
Yeah.
live in,
No,
and
I think often what it means to be living in a world where every day there's just fewer and fewer people who have a lived memory of World War II, even not as soldiers, but as people who witnessed, the destruction in Europe and in Asia. And I partially feel that that is one of the factors that is driving kind of this increase in authoritarianism across the world.
yeah, and there's this notion I think we've lost, and we got it back in 9/11 for about 10 minutes of like we're in this together, right? Like we're
Yeah.
on this like crazy spinning rock in space. And space is really, infinite. We have to ask your son how infinite space is. But
Yes.
but we're like on this rock, and like we're all so fundamentally more the same than we are different. And even like in a micro, like I live in a fairly rural area, like even like politically, right? The hot issues, most people agree on actually sort of the bigger issues. There's just a few like hot issues that people just really put wedges between people in, but we've lost this sort of collective vision of bringing us all along together to better everybody. Like, somewhere along the way we've like lost this.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, being on a rock floating in space. And like, to me, that's something, I mean, that's my interest in Star Trek. That's like kind of my higher power, though that's not really a thing in the recovery program I participate in. And that is like, nobody can tell me where we are and what this is. Like, no one can tell me what purpose what purpose existence is for. No one can tell me in like satisfying terms what reality is. Like, it's just kind of here, and we're in it, and we're having this experience. And if I'm being honest, it's not always great. But until someone can answer those two things in satisfying terms, like where are we and what is this? Like, I don't think anybody's authority over anyone else is valid, like
Yeah.
reliably valid. And so that's what I like kind of bring it back to. Like, and I know, like, my mom, I love my mom so much, but like when I like talk about the immensity of the universe or like the concept of infinity, she like has a panic attack and is like, no, that's just too much. But like for me, that calms me down. Like I need to contemplate that, and that like recenters me in a way that I know some people that works for them, but other people it's like, oh, this is too freaky. I just need to know there's a guy up in the cloud and he's watching over me and it's going to be okay.
Yeah, I mean, to me, like the vastness is just beautiful, and you see some of these incredible photos from like space telescopes and all that. I'm like, to me, it is sort of calming to be like, the universe is so infinite, and there's a lot that can't be explained. And, I'm not really a higher power guy. I did have a grandmother once say that God is love, and the story. I was like, all right, I'm down with that. Like
Yeah.
I can be down with that notion. But just like, we don't know what the ends of the universe are. Like, it is pretty wild. Like, and yeah, you can get lost in that, like, or be scared by that. But I'm like, I don't know. I just think it's kind of
Yeah.
incredible.
I like to believe in a cyclical universe. One where there's just like perpetual like creation, death through entropy, and then creation again. Um, and I don't know, I'm getting way off into a tangent, but there's like a number of really interesting, like theories in physics that kind of point to that in one way or another, or in multiple ways. And that's something that gets me through too. Like in this universe, like, yeah, my childhood was not safe or happy, but there's like some other infinite number of universes where maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe in that universe, I turn out to be a real big jerk because I never had to like address, the issues that were causing me so much discomfort and causing me to, be a pain in other people's asses.
Yeah. I mean, and to me, we all are the products of all the things, right? You can't take away, and this helps me as a parent too. I think, like, when your kids are having something hard, like it is okay for kids to struggle, right? Like that's 100% okay. Like it does help you grow as a person. And you can't pull out like one piece of like who we are or what happened. And I'm like
Yeah.
seen it like with my own kids, like things that have happened. And then you're like, oh, I see this, where this went, and it went to this good place. It was shit at the time, but like where they are and what they learned from is incredible.
Well, it's like in Buddhism, there's this like concept of um, independent origination. I've heard it also expressed as interdependent origination, which I like better. And essentially what that is that like anything that exists has multiple, basically unknowable causes and conditions that led to that thing. And, nothing exists on its own except for the like totality of reality that isn't like defined by or in some other kind of relationship with another concept or event. And it's funny you mentioned that because it makes me think of something about my own family history in World War II, which is, like my dad's mother had a lot of unaddressed grief because she was engaged to a man who went off to war and was killed. And that showed up, and like it showed up. I have memories of her like crying at inappropriate times or having conversations about war with me where she's like in tears, and it's, this is like not an appropriate conversation to be having with, an 8-year-old, who's going through their own traumatic experience that no one's aware of. And so I know that like affected my dad and his personality and the way he raised me, and it affected my relationship with her. And there are times where I feel resentment towards her for that. But if that man hadn't been killed in World War II, she would have never married my grandfather. She'd have had kids with someone else. I wouldn't be here to bitch about my problems that feel like they don't have a satisfying solution. And isn't this better than nothing? I mean, I'd like to think it is.
Yeah, it is funny, that thing you think about it, it's like you're just one like DNA strand, right? Like
Yeah.
in forever, right?
Yeah.
Like in your entire genetic history is just one person who fell and hit their head one day or something, or it's like Back to the Future. But one other thing before we wrap up is like, what was the first hardcore punk band? Just to circle, but I've talked like I seem to get a lot of people into punk on this. So like, what was the gateway?
So, well, it's funny because I wanted to get some more about your like hardcore and punk scene.
Yeah. Oh, we can keep going.
You've had a number of people on your show, like Mark Miller from Buffalo is someone who I'm familiar with and have chatted with a handful of times. And then you've had Dave Haas, I think. Is that how you pronounce his last name? Yeah. But anyways, maybe we can have you on as a guest on Common Thread sometime and do a deeper dive into that. But for me, let's see. Okay, so I've told this story. I've had a couple podcasts. I have Common Thread now with Rory, but I had another one called the Hardcore Archive Podcast, which is a slightly different format. It was a little more straightforward, like, hey, you got a new record coming out. What are your influences? Where did you record? And Common Thread is, I should probably do a better job plugging this podcast too, because I'm excited to get more people listening to it. Common Thread is more about how people take the values and the ethics and the philosophies that just keep showing up again and again in hardcore and punk and apply them in ways in their life that have nothing to do with music. How did hardcore and punk help get you to where you are today? Kind of that, encounter you might have at a high school reunion. And so we, Rory and I are interviewing folks, who work in, education and activism and healthcare, about how hardcore and punk show up in their daily lives, the way they parent their kids and the way they conduct themselves at work. Because we both know that it's had a huge influence on ours. So anyways, hardcore and punk, I've told this story a number of times. So if you've heard me yap on about this, you can hit skip a couple times and I'll be done, I swear. But the first hardcore song I ever heard, like the first legitimate hardcore song I ever heard, and I had like some awareness of punk because like Green Day and The Offspring were popular in the 90s, and I had those CDs. And I liked the energy and I liked the speed, most importantly. But the first like legit hardcore song I ever heard was Sick of It All's Step Down off of their Scratch the Surface CD. And the place I heard it on was Beavis and Butthead, and they were making fun of the music video. And the music video is like just kind of a primer on the different types of like dance moves you might see in a pit in a hardcore show, picking up change and, like the pizza maker dance move, which you don't see so much anymore, but picking up change is a classic. People are always doing that. And then it would be like interspliced with like Beavis and Butthead doing made up hardcore dance moves, like picking a wedgie out of their like butt or something. But I thought it was like such a wild kind of music, and it had so much energy that I was like, I need to get this. And I went to the mall like that weekend and found that CD and bought it. And then from there, like before the internet, how do you find out about stuff? You're like scouring the liner notes, like, oh, here they're thanking these other bands. What do these bands sound like? You go and check out those records. So it started, in a proto way with like bands like, Offspring and Green Day. But then it blossomed into Sick of It All was like an early, important band for me. Earth Crisis is another band that's really hard for me to overstate just how much influence they've had in my life.
Right. Syracuse band.
Yeah. I mean, the regional thing for sure. But as I mentioned, that was straight edge from like 14 to 35. I've been vegan for I think 23 or 24 years now. It's influenced me politically. That's still kind of the type of hardcore I'm most interested in. But other bands that have been very important to me, Bane is an important band. Shai Hulud is another one. Anything that's fast and melodic, and then also has occasional heavy breakdowns. And I'm not afraid to like mix a little bit of metal influence into the hardcore that I like. Although I do like just straight up hardcore bands like Minor Threat and Youth of Today, and the more traditional old school types of hardcore. I should also say too, I play the drums, as you mentioned. I'm in a band called World Purge. We're based out of Rochester. We're on social media and all the streaming platforms. So, if you like bands that are influenced by like Turmoil and Harvest, Endeavor, kind of that late 90s, early 2000s, hardcore with a little bit of metal influence, you can check that out too.
Yeah, that'd be great. It would be fun to be on your podcast because we could go all night talking about that other stuff. And, I'm sort of probably about 10 years your senior, a little more, so I was coming up in the 80s. So it was
Yeah.
also like, just a different time of like, who were the bands? Like for me, it was straight up, it was the Clash was like the first thing, and then Exploited. And it's like, but it was like going to record stores, and, it was a different time. Like, right. There's no algorithm. It was community was your algorithm.
Yeah, and it's and we're spoiled now. I can just stream anything by any band ever, and I like it. I like the archivist and the librarian in me like loves it, but it makes it feel less special. Like there were tons of times I'd order bands, through mail order, wait months for the record to come. Sometimes it never came, only for it to be like a huge disappointment. And it's like, well, how did this crappy record influence like the best record of the best band I've ever heard? And even to this day, if I find like out of print material, I buy it. I just like want to hoard it because it's like some of this stuff, they're never going to make it again on a physical format. Maybe it's on YouTube or something and I can bring it up if I want. But I've just always collected it because you never know when you're going to encounter it again. You may not.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much great stuff that was out there that is sort of, it's just gone. It's not even on the streaming, some of the smaller bands along the way.
Oh yeah, it's like all they had was a demo tape and they never played a show out of their hometown, but like some random band from Ann Arbor, Michigan might have been doing the perfect style of music for your tastes, and they're speaking about the exact experience you had to go through. So, it's actually like how I wound up getting into podcasting was I had this Instagram where I was just archiving old show flyers and demos from Rochester bands. And I still have the SoundCloud, like it's called the Rochester Hardcore History SoundCloud, where I have like all these old cassette tapes that I ripped in 7 inches. And I put it out there because I'm like, well, some of these songs were profoundly meaningful to me and they're not on anywhere else. Like they're not on YouTube. I want people to be able to access them again. And it's just been such a great way to like give back to the community that has supported me and helped me become the person I am.
Yeah, that's awesome. And thank you so much for taking the time to be on.
I thank you too.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening. Sober Dad Crew is a DIY project by Stephen Kimball, who writes, edits, and produces the show. To support the show, please review it where you listen to podcasts or visit soberdadcrew.com to buy some merchandise or make a donation.